All right, welcome back to our study of the book of Revelation here on the listener's commentary. In our last recording, we gave the backstory to the book, the original situation and setting that motivated the book and what was going on in the lives of the original audience that helps us understand some of the things said in the book. So we looked at the backstory in the last recording, and where we sort of ended that, or at least close to the end, we raised the question of genre. That is, what type of literature is the book of Revelation? It's an important question for us to ask with regard to Revelation because Revelation feels so odd and weird to us. When we sit down to read it, we're left scratching our heads and wondering what's going on, and it just seems somewhat weird. That has to do with the type of literature that it is. And so in this recording, we want to just take a little bit of time to talk specifically about the nature of apocalyptic literature. We noted in the backstory discussion that Revelation is really a hybrid type of literature. It's a combination of letter. It's a letter addressed to real churches living in a real place and time. So it's a letter that's also a prophecy in the form of apocalyptic. That's what Revelation is. It's a letter of prophecy in the form of apocalyptic literature. And therefore, if we're going to read Revelation well, we need to at least be familiar with that there is such a thing as apocalyptic literature. It isn't like Revelation is completely alone in the type of literature it is, and some things about the nature of apocalyptic literature. So let's just talk a little bit about, first off, what do we mean when we say apocalyptic literature? Well, that term, apocalyptic, comes from the Greek word apokalypsis. That word means revelation or unveiling. And it's actually the very first word in the book of Revelation. That's how it gets its name. The apocalypsis of Jesus Christ. That is the revelation of Jesus Christ. And that's the name or the title of the book. It's the apocalypsis. It's the revelation. The irony of that is that while the word means revelation or unveiling or disclosing, when we read Revelation, oftentimes it feels anything but revealing. It feels more like confusing and like you're not making anything clear. You're not revealing anything. What in the world are you even talking about? But that's what apocalyptic literature is really supposed to do. It's supposed to be a type of literature in which God reveals his hidden future plans. He reveals what's happening in the world and helps maybe pull back the curtain and unveil, here's what's going on in the world, here's what's happening, and here's what I'm going to do about it. And that's exactly what the book of Revelation does as a type of apocalyptic literature. And the form of apocalyptic literature, dreams and visions and symbols, makes its communication a little less direct than other types of literature. Think like a letter. A letter speaks very directly to the situation of the audience. Well, as apocalyptic literature, even though it's a letter, Revelation speaks less directly. Think by way of example of a political cartoon. A political cartoon, I think, is a great analogy for how the book of Revelation intends to communicate, because with a political cartoon, you have pictures, no words, pictures that intend to communicate some message. And it communicates it purely through the known force of those images. One that I've used in class a number of times when I've taught about apocalyptic literature is it's a picture from a political cartoon of a super tall giant man with a stovetop hat on that's striped with stars around it on a ribbon. And this man is wearing striped pants. And he's bowing before what looks like two giant tombstones with all sorts of what looks like names on these giant tombstones. But these tombstones are actually like buildings set in the midst of a city. And that political cartoon was first released in newspapers around the country I live in, the United States of America, shortly after the events of 9/11. What's the picture communicating? Well, the picture of this giant man is Uncle Sam, dressed up in royal kind of regalia, right? The regalia of the nation. Red, white, and blue striped pants and a striped hat. And he's bowing before the Twin Towers, who are now made out to look like tombstones with all the names of the people who died in the Twin Towers on 9/11. There's no words, but you can look at that image, and in the original setting, you know exactly what the message is. This is a picture of the nation grieving for what happened on 9/11. That's what a political cartoon does. You can see political cartoons that are addressing current events of the time, and when you look at those cartoons, you recognize the images, right? Like if you have a picture of an eagle and a picture of a bear, and some sort of interaction between them, you know we're talking about nations, even though we literally don't think the nations are eagles and bears. Well, that's very much the way apocalyptic literature was intended to communicate. It's less direct than letters, normal letters, right? But it does communicate a message based on well-known imagery of the day. And you can actually see the roots of apocalyptic literature in some of the Old Testament books. For example, Daniel and Zechariah use sort of like an early version of apocalyptic literature, sort of like the roots of it that kind of came full flower later on with their visions and their images for nations as beasts and all sorts of things like that. That approach to communicating messages from God became quite popular among the Jews in the late centuries BC, around 150, 200 BC, all the way up until just after the time period of the book of Revelation. And it became popular among the Jews as a way to talk about what was happening in the world around them with all the chaos and all the foreign nations ruling them. So as a way to talk about what was going on around them and provide encouragement that God hadn't lost control and he still would achieve his purposes. The point of that is that the kind of literature that makes Revelation feel so weird to us was actually a well-known type of literature that John was familiar with. And God then communicates this message to John in these visions and then tells John to write it down and send it to the churches. And so that's what Revelation is. It is a letter of prophecy in the form of apocalyptic literature. So let me give you 4 key characteristics of apocalyptic literature. So as you read through Revelation, you at least know what's happening and what you're looking for. The first characteristic of apocalyptic literature is visions. Visions. The storyline of, in this case, the book of Revelation, involves the reception of visions by the writer. That's just kind of standard in all forms of apocalyptic literature that we have. The author of the book, in our case, John, sees things in dreams or visions. In fact, normally these come through a kind of like a heavenly tour guide. He's a heavenly intermediary, an angel, in the case of Revelation, who points out things and kind of conducts the seer, the visionary, on a tour of these great scenes. And Revelation works very much that way. In fact, at the very beginning of the book, John tells us that he was told, write down the things which you saw and pass them on to the churches. And as you read through Revelation, what you'll hear over and over again is John says, then I saw, and then I saw, or another sign appeared. So he's writing down what he saw. And you can imagine that can be challenging enough when it's normal stuff you see, but when you see these wild visions with some of the crazy symbols and some of the crazy pictures that John saw, it's like, how do I describe that? And so he's writing down the things he saw for us. That's the first characteristic of apocalyptic. Visions that John saw that he's going to write down for us. Second characteristic that is pretty standard in all examples of apocalyptic literature is tribulation. Difficulty, hardship, affliction. What I mean by that is the time period of the author and the original audience is described as a time of trouble for them. It's a time of trouble for God's people and tribulation for God's people. And the future is pictured then as ultimately a time of divine triumph and deliverance. So the original author and the original audience are experiencing difficulty and tribulation. In fact, that's the reason apocalyptic literature flourished so much at the time period it did, because it was such an awful time period in Jewish history, such an awful time period to be living in Israel. And so in Daniel, which uses some sort of, like I already noted, early apocalyptic approaches, right? They're under Babylonian captivity and things aren't going well. Where is God in the midst of it? Well, for Revelation, it's Roman persecution. It's on the rise, and the hostility towards God's people in Asia Minor and threats from the governors and the imperial forces is growing, and John himself has been exiled. It's a time period of difficulty. That's why at the very outset of the book of Revelation, in Revelation chapter 1, verse 9, John writes this. He says, I, John, your brother and fellow participant, that is, fellow sharer in the tribulation and kingdom and perseverance in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. John looks at what's going on with them and describes it as the tribulation. We're going through a very difficult time period. That's pretty standard for apocalyptic literature. It grew out of a time of crisis when it seemed like God no longer cared for his people or somehow had lost control over his creation because everything was going off the rails. And in response, apocalyptic literature, through its visions and its compelling pictures, held out hope that God was still sovereign, he was still in charge, and he ultimately would deliver his people and he would win the day. So, apocalyptic literature makes use of visions. It's written during a time of tribulation. Number three, the third characteristic is it makes wide use of symbols. The story of apocalyptic literature, in whatever book it is, in our case Revelation, is told in a series of dramatic presentations that make use of imaginative, often kind of like feeling like bizarre symbols. And the way we need to think about that is it's like a giant stage drama with costumes and props and crazy characters. Think, if you will, of the well-known epic by J.R. Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings, and some of the crazy characters and all the different kinds of people in that story, whether the movie version or the book version, right? That's what apocalyptic literature did, and that's what Revelation does. It's like this giant drama with these costumes and props and wild characters, and often the symbols and the characters are drawn from the world of fantasy, and they seem strange and bizarre. So you get a beast with 7 heads, or you get locusts with scorpions' tails but having a human head, or you get winged lions, all sorts of crazy things that show up in apocalyptic literature and in the book of Revelation in particular. And John notes this for us right at the outset. As he begins the book of Revelation, he writes these words. He says, the revelation of Jesus Christ, that is from Jesus, which God gave to Jesus to show to his bondservants the things which must soon take place. And then he says this, listen to what he says. And he sent, and here's the word, and communicated it by his angel to his bondservant John. That word, communicated, there is actually the verb form of the noun that's regularly translated sign in John's gospel. In John's gospel, it's famous for having 7 signs, right? Well, that's the noun. The word translated communicated in Revelation 1:1 is the verb. In other words, he signified it. He told it in sign language. That's the idea of that very word right there. So John, at the beginning, tells us what the revelation is going to be. He tells us what kind of communication is. God used sign language to communicate something to John that John's now supposed to pass on to the churches. And that sign language shows up in these dramatic presentations using crazy characters and wild symbols that's supposed to communicate the message. And that's standard for apocalyptic literature. So you have all sorts of symbols. And then the fourth characteristic of apocalyptic literature is numbers. There are sort of like stock numbers in apocalyptic literature that have consistent symbolic value. It's sort of like in certain genres of literature or movies today. The number 13, for example, has if you're in a horror movie and you all of a sudden encounter the number 13, uh-oh, this is bad. Not because number 13 by itself is bad, but in that type of movie, 13 has consistent symbolic value. Well, that's the way it works in apocalyptic literature as well. The numbers 3, 4, 7, 10, 12, and 70 are common in all kinds of apocalyptic books, and they are common in the book of Revelation. Like 4 typically has something to do with the earth because of the 4 points of the compass. 7 typically has to do with God's purposes and completion because of the 7 days of creation. 12 has to do with God's people because of the number 12 from the 12 tribes and the number 12 from the 12 apostles. And so these numbers had a particular meaning beyond their numerical value. They communicated something significant. And so as you read through Revelation, we've got to at least recognize these numbers mean something more than just there's 3 of this or 4 of that or 10 of that. They're communicating a message that has symbolic value because of the genre in which they're found. So those are the 4 characteristics of apocalyptic literature. And just knowing that will help us realize, okay, this is a type of literature that uses these type of things to address this type of situation, all with the aim of trying to remind us who's really in charge in the world and what's really going on. And as you read through Revelation, you have to remember that you're still seeking the author's intended meaning. You're not free to make up your own meaning. That when John saw this, God was communicating a message to John that John understood a certain way. John then wrote down what he saw for the churches to pass on that same message to them. And so the meaning of Revelation must fit its historical context. It must have been something that its original readers could have understood. And then once we understand that, then we're free to begin to think about what message does that say to us today? So let me just give you a few reading tips, guidelines for reading Revelation as apocalyptic literature well. The first is this. What's the ancient meaning of the symbol? What's the ancient meaning of the symbol? Symbolism and imagination fascinated the ancient peoples more than statistical accuracy. And so as we read it, we need to try to say, okay, do we have any idea of how the ancient people would have understood this symbol? And the more we're familiar with, obviously, ancient kind of mythological and symbolic literature, that'll help us. But that provides at least an anchor point for us. We're not free to kind of make up our own understanding of the symbol. What's the ancient meaning of the symbol? And one of the things that helps us with that is recognizing that in the book of Revelation, some of the symbols are interpreted for us. So as we're reading through it, is the symbol anywhere interpreted in the immediate context? For example, in Revelation chapter 1, we learn that the 7 stars are the messengers of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. Those 2 symbols, 7 stars and 7 lampstands, are interpreted for us. Or in Revelation 17, we're told that the 7 heads of this beast, the 7 heads, are the 7 hills on which the woman sits. Well, now that symbol of the 7 heads is interpreted for us. Oh, it's not literal heads, it's 7 hills. And everyone in the ancient world would have known what that symbol then referred to, because Rome was the city sitting on 7 hills, right? So is the symbol interpreted anywhere for us in the immediate context? That'll be at least one thing that'll help us understand the ancient meaning of the symbol. Second guideline for reading Revelation as apocalyptic literature well, pay close attention to the Old Testament background. That Revelation alludes to and quotes from and repackages Old Testament symbols, Old Testament ideas in a variety of ways. And so it's going to be littered with Old Testament imagery and ideas and repackaging of those ideas. So try to pay close attention to the Old Testament background. A third guideline for reading Revelation well is step back and just ask yourself, what's the main point of the text? Maybe we can't figure out all the details. Maybe there's things that are confusing and don't make sense to us. Okay, got it. But really, the key is the main point of the vision, not maybe the significance of every detail. I'm convinced that meaning in Revelation is to be found in the whole vision. And so the vision of the seven seals or the vision of the seven trumpets, let's not get lost in every little detail. What's the point of the whole vision? What's the theological significance of that specific vision? I think that's the best question for us. I kind of think of it like a Vincent van Gogh impressionistic painting, if you will. You get up right up close to that painting and you see all the little dots and dashes, right? But you step back from the painting and you look at it from a distance and it's like, oh, all those little dots and dashes contribute to this image, this picture. That's what we want to pay attention to as we read through Revelation. What's the theological significance of the vision as a whole? And then the fourth tip for helping us read Revelation well is, how does this provide comfort or help to the distressed? How does it encourage faithfulness in the midst of difficulty? Remember, apocalyptic literature is written during times of tribulation, crises, difficulty. Revelation is clearly written during that. John says he's a participant in that. And so it's a way to help overcome the mindset of spiritual discouragement and despair, right? That's the idea. And as you read through Revelation, you'll see that John has pastoral concern for his audience, and he pronounces blessings on those who endure and those who are faithful and those who read the book. And so there's this pastoral concern. And so let's not get so lost in all the details of the visions and so lost in what does this refer to and what does that refer to, that we miss that this is intended to provide strength and resolve and encouragement towards faithful discipleship to Jesus in the midst of a world that makes discipleship hard. Revelation's primary purpose is to encourage suffering saints and saints who are dealing with discouragement of being faithful to Jesus. And so how does this provide help to the distressed and encouragement to those struggling to be faithful? And then my final bit of encouragement as we read through Revelation together is be humble. Be humble. Set a modest goal. Don't convince yourself that you're going to be able to understand everything perfectly. Let's aim for a responsible and reasonable understanding of what the text is saying. Apocalyptic literature, Revelation in particular, presents us with probably some of the Bible's most difficult passages to figure out and interpret, particularly when we don't recognize that this literature had a particular way of functioning. So let's just be humble and say, okay, I think that's what this symbol is about. I think that's what John is getting at by this, but there's places where it's really difficult to know for certain. And humility really would go a long way to helping us be gracious with brothers and sisters who see it differently than us, and recognizing that we're going to have to kind of just keep coming back to this book over and over again to hear it well and to make sense out of its visions. All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament. The Listener's Commentary is made possible by the generous support of people just like you. So thanks a ton to each and every one of you who support and give to make this commentary possible. And if you have been blessed or impacted in any way by the Listener's Commentary, could I invite you to prayerfully consider joining the team of supporters? Easiest way to do that is to go to listenerscommentary.com, click the Give button. It'll redirect you to a page, my page at World Family Mission. World Family Mission is a registered nonprofit. They provide all of the paperwork and financial support for ministries like this. And you can set up a one-time or a recurring monthly donation right there at that page. And all those monies then will come my way to support the commentary. Thanks a ton for your support.